What's on my New Orleans Saints Christmas wish list? We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome in and Merry Christmas for another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ross Jackson, credentialed media member covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, for Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the team. And on today's episode, we're going through a Christmas wish list, not necessarily things that Derek Carr, Dennis Allen, and the New Orleans Saints can actually provide on Christmas, but a Christmas wish list of things that we're looking for this team to do by the time that the year is out. The season, odds are, is kind of done at this point. I'll explain to you why. We're going to take a look at how the team can finish strong, what you want to see for next year, and of course, what it is that Derek Carr can do to bring home a Merry Christmas by the end of the season. I appreciate you, as always, for being an everydayer and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So let me start here real quick. And usually I dive right into the content and everything, but I do want to do a little Christmas thing here for a moment, if you'll bear with me. You can always skip forward, all that stuff, no problem, totally fine. But as a holiday thing here, I just want to explain why I'm doing an episode on Christmas Day. And I'm literally recording, like this is Christmas Day as we're recording. And I'm doing this because if you're like me, you live far away from your family. There are a lot of folks like me that, don't necessarily have family around them for a variety of different reasons, some more serious than others, things like that. But this is an opportunity I felt to provide at least some kind of, for 30 minutes, a community, right? Whether it's people chatting in the comments section, whether it's just listening and it's you and me, stuff like that. Like, I thought maybe it would be good to have some sense of community for people that might not necessarily have a sense of community around them. So that's why I'm choosing to do an episode today. And I hope that for people that have a community around them, people that don't yet have a community around them, that this can bring some semblance of a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays for those that take the time to tune in. It's always an honor to earn your time every day. Christmas Day, no different, right? Like, I want to earn your time if you've got the time to give me, right? So I want to be here. And then even if folks listen to this on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, like, this is going to be content that will be good for everyone, no matter when they listen. So that's why I'm choosing to do this Merry Christmas episode and for still being here on Christmas Day. It's not necessarily that I'm a workaholic, though there is like a little tinge of that. All right, so let's take a look at what it is that I think that Derek Carr could provide Saints fans that would be the best thing that he could provide by the end of the year. Now, by the end of the season. Now, I want to acknowledge that a lot of people are going to say, well, he should stink it up. That way the Saints move on from him and things like that. I'm going to stay away from that portion of it. Is that a part of the realm of infinite possibilities of how the season can end and the offseason can go? 100%. Absolutely. Like, anything can happen. We never say never in the NFL, but I'm going to stick a little bit more to here's an opportunity to give people something to hope for going into next season. Because let's face it, there's a lot of Saints fans right now that are very frustrated with this organization, that are very frustrated with this team, and that are very frustrated with Derek Carr as a quarterback. He was the $150 million quarterback that was supposed to kind of swoop in and not necessarily save everything. He was actually very much against that type of language during his introductory press conference, but he was supposed to be the guy to come in and kind of help them go to the next level. We didn't necessarily see that this year. And I have my reasons for that we'll actually get to in the second segment when I go to all I want for next year is a new blank blank. We'll get to that here in a moment. But that was a part of what Derek Carr's story was supposed to be. And no one really should have expected it to happen right off the bat. But a lot of people warranted, including myself, expected it to work the first year. Not necessarily right away, not necessarily the first 4 games, but for it to work out. So these last 2 games give Derek Carr an opportunity again to be able to give people something to hope for going into next year. Look, the Saints are very likely not making the playoffs this year. Like, let's just call it what it is. They need to win out. They need to win next week against the Bucs in Tampa. They'll need to win at home week 18 against the Atlanta Falcons, a game we're going to dive into a little bit before we end the show. But they also need in Week 18 the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to lose to the Carolina Panthers. So the Carolina Panthers have played spoiler. They've been ultra competitive here over the course of the past couple of weeks. They beat the Atlanta Falcons last week over a wild score of 9-7. They went 33-30, and it was really one controversial play call, or what, not play call, officiating call. Surprise, surprise. Hello, NFL. Still having trouble with those officials, I see. That really kept the Panthers from being able to topple the Green Bay Packers on Christmas Eve. And so you look at kind of what it is that the Saints need done in order to be able to get to the playoffs. It doesn't seem likely that that's going to happen. Now, they have a path to the wild card still, but it requires like 6 different things to happen, a long list of teams to lose, including the Rams and the Lions and the Seahawks and all these other things. Those things just don't necessarily, or the Bears need to beat, it's just like you need like the end of the end of the NFL season to just kind of be chaos and everything, which is fun, don't get me wrong, but unlikely. So that's why I say it's unlikely, but not at all impossible that the New Orleans Saints make the playoffs. So what does having a strong last 2 games, if you're Derek Carr, really give this team, really give the fan base? And really it's all about next season, right? Can you help a guy like A.T. Perry shine? Can you help a guy like Rashid Shaheed close out his season strong? Can you help a guy like Chris Olave finish his season strong? Can you command this offense in such a way that people kind of see that, okay, well, maybe with a better offensive system in place, things would be a lot better here in New Orleans? There's a real opportunity to kind of start that process. And not everyone's going to buy it. Not everyone's going to buy in. I'll still be skeptical. Forgive me. I mean, not forgive me, but believe me, once the season starts next year, no matter how exciting things look in training camp, I will 100% be the New Orleans, 100% be all about how the New Orleans Saints and Derek Carr have to prove it to me. I'm not going to buy in right away the way that I did early on at the beginning of this season. I say that now. We'll see what happens come September, but I truly believe that. Like, there's every reason to kind of have not even a cautious optimism, but a caution going into next season. And maybe there's something that Derek Carr can do with a pair of very strong games against a Tampa Bay team that made it really tough for him earlier on in the season, coming back off the injury and everything. I know the AC joint was a part of that, but even still, there was a lot that didn't work in that game. Now he's got an opportunity to maybe rebound in front of a home audience and show a little something for that, to where maybe people do go from cautious to cautiously optimistic going into next season. And then, a win at home against the Atlanta Falcons probably goes a long way too. And so maybe there is something that can be done there. I know a lot of people are going to say, no, there's nothing that can be done and all these other things, but that's not the way that Derek Carr and the New Orleans Saints should look at it. They should be looking at exactly what it is that they have said over and over again, which is, how do we give this crowd, these fans, something to cheer for, something to not necessarily buy into, not necessarily believe in, but maybe start to lay the groundwork so that maybe by the time that you reach September of next year, maybe October of next year, and you've put some things on tape in live action, maybe there is a sense of buy-in if there's success early on in the season. But I think that success early on in the season can be aided by success late in the season. And I think that's part of what Derek Carr can do for New Orleans Saints fans as a kind of post-Christmas gift or a Christmas gift as the season begins to wrap up. And again, it's not all going to be perfect. It's not supposed to be. That's okay. And I'm not sitting here trying to sell wet to the ocean or anything and say, hey, look, Derek Carr and the New Orleans Saints are really going to prove something at the end of this year. They might not. But is the opportunity there? 100%. And should they take advantage of it? Yes. Will they take advantage of it? We're going to learn. We're going to learn. Not today, but we're going to learn. All right, coming up next, all I want for next year for the New Orleans Saints is a new what? We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and the official sports betting partner here on the Locked On Podcast Network, giving you everything that you need across the NFL, NBA, MLB, and much more. Golf, whole bunch of different things that you can get in on over at FanDuel, whether it's player spreads or whether it's team spreads, whether it's player props, whether it's you look for maybe over-unders. You can loop everything together into parlays too to make winning even easier and all that. There's a whole bunch of stuff over there for you. And right now, if you're a first-time customer, it gets even better, right? So you can get $150 in bonus bets as a new customer by simply winning your first $5 bet. You put $5 down on your first bet on a heavy favorite. If you get that, you win that. $150 coming your way. So you can use that bonus bets on all of the stuff that we just mentioned, spreads, player props, all of that. So go and check them out today, FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. All I want for the next year for the New Orleans Saints is what? We got that coming up for you. Appreciate you, everydayers, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out that 24/7 national sports live stream, the one and only, nation's first, over at Locked On Sports Today on YouTube. Go and check them out, Locked On Sports Today. All right, so what is it that I want? So this is kind of like a play on all I want for Christmas, right? But instead of me being Mariah, I'm Ross. So all I want for the new year, for the next season, is a new offensive system. That's the big thing. And many of you that, those of you that, if you're an everydayer, you knew where I was going with this, probably 100%. And you're like, yeah, Ross, we know that there's a need for a new offensive system. But just the more that I dig into this New Orleans Saints offense, the more questions get raised for me. And usually that's not the way that it works, right? The more time you usually spend diving into and learning an offense and all that. Like I've told y'all that I spent, 6 hours watching Los Angeles Rams tape last week on the offensive side to get ready for it was like the Tuesday preview episode that we did. And a big part of why I did that is because there was so much new to learn. And it answered a lot of questions by watching it over and over again and going, oh, okay, so then there's this, that, and the other. And a lot of what you learn is, taking things that are unpredictable, making them predictable in your mind, taking things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, making yourself expect them, and then starting to look at, okay, well, how do you change these things, or how do you tweak it just slightly so that it looks like this, but turns out to be this, all that kind of stuff. Whereas in the Saints offense, it's just more questions every week, every time that why isn't this happening? Why aren't they doing this? What happened to this? They did this last week. Why aren't they doing it all of a sudden? All that. You look back to the Giants game, which was maybe the Saints' best offensive performance, that wasn't contingent upon how bad the New York Giants defense is. And don't get me wrong, the New York Giants defense is bad. It's horrid. But the thing about it is that a lot of the stuff that the Saints did was not contingent. The success that they found was not contingent on New York being bad. It was contingent upon what they did. The play calls made sense in the particular situations. 50% of their passing plays had motion. The majority of their run plays had motion. I think it was like 20 of 22 or something like that. Or no. It was 20 of 25 or something around that area. But 3 of those runs were also kneel downs and stuff. So, just a whole bunch of that you're used to seeing around the NFL that we haven't seen in New Orleans. And all of a sudden we did against the New York Giants. And then you get to the Los Angeles Rams game and then boom, everything kind of falls apart. And I think that what I've learned about the New Orleans Saints offensive system is that it's really good when everything goes perfectly. But the moment that, and when I say everything goes perfectly, I mean, a lack of turnovers or giveaways rather, holding a lead early on in the game, getting in rhythm, the players being able to get in rhythm early and things like that. Like a lot of stuff just has to go perfectly. And then all of a sudden the system is what the system was against the the New England Patriots, the New York Giants, a little bit the Carolina Panthers, but not necessarily, right? Like that game was mostly a mirage in terms of what it looked like. But I think that that's really the thing that I learned with all the question marks that come up. You kind of have to take a step back and go, okay, so then what answers all these questions? And the thing that answers all these questions is that, well, Saints need everything to kind of go perfectly on the offensive side. And if they don't, it almost feels like a panic sets in. I mean, you look at that 2-minute drive and look, I asked Dennis Allen about it. He told me he didn't feel like that 2-minute drive at the end of the first half against the Rams was frantic, but it certainly felt that way looking at it. And it still feels that way when I go back and I watch it again. And I'm not trying to sit here and challenge DA. He's the coach. He knows way better than I do. But I can see energy, right? You can see energy. And you look at the composure of the Rams 2-minute drive as they came back. And granted, they had more timeouts, but the Saints still had 2 timeouts in theirs. And so things just didn't go perfectly. And then it feels like when that happens, everybody just kind of regresses in a way, right? It's back to runs on 2nd and 10 after an incomplete pass. It's back to, deep shots on 3rd and short. It's back to, screen passes when they don't make sense. It's back to a lack of protection, and lack of play action, things, no moving out of the pockets, things like that. Like the things that made the Saints look so much more creative against the New York Giants, things that made the Saints look so much more creative against the New England Patriots, which I think was mostly narrative than it was actually display. We kind of broke down that New England Patriots game. There wasn't really much different that they did in that game. I know a lot of people say, oh, well, they did a whole bunch of motion and stuff. They didn't. They did what they usually did and stuff. It just worked. And they did it a little bit differently. So the percentage didn't creep up. It was just the style and the way that they ran it. But there's validity in that, right? There's value in that. And we just didn't necessarily see that from the Saints when things aren't going their way. It's like when the other team scores first, scores a touchdown first, they kind of fall apart in a way over on the offensive side trying to respond. And I think a lot of that has more to do with the system, has a lot to do with the coordinator, has a lot to do with play calling before it really impacts the players. And I think that frantic nature has to come from somewhere. And from what we've seen from Derek Carr throughout his career, and I know Derek Carr is not not a lot of Derek Carr fans out there right now. I understand, I get it. But like what we've seen from Derek Carr over the course of his career is a guy that's usually calm, cool, and collected in those situations, right? He's the guy that had like the most game-winning drives and the most fourth quarter comebacks out of any active quarterback after Tom Brady retired, or he was like in the top 5 or some conversation around that, right? Like that was like a big calling card for him. That was a big thing that the Saints wanted, was that they wanted that calmness. And the calmness wasn't there with Jameis. The calmness wasn't there with Andy Dalton. And now the calmness isn't there with Derek Carr. So what's the common denominator? It's the offense, right? Like if it's not working with several different quarterbacks, then there's a reason that it's not working. And it doesn't necessarily, although it's easy to point fingers at the players, doesn't necessarily come down to the player. And I think some people take it as like, oh, well, pointing fingers at the offensive coordinator is super easy too. And that's usually what coaches will throw at you and stuff like that. And all, but like when there's evidence, right? And for me, there's evidence. And so for me, when I look at what I want from the Saints going, or what I want for the Saints going into next year, it's a new offensive system. There's no reason that they should run this back exactly as it is again going into next year. There's no excuse for that. And honestly, the Saints would have a hard time selling that. And I think they should know that, and very likely do as well. So just in terms of the honest conversation here, the Saints need a new offensive system, and they need one that's a little bit more updated. I gave some names to insiders, Locked On Saints insiders, during one of our Q&As. We call them Crew&As. If you want to take part in that, text Who Dat to 504-285-7473 if you want to be a part of things like that. But like, the thing that I look at when we talked about that is, okay, well, where do you go? Like, where do you find people in the system and stuff like that? And there's a ton of options going into next year. And some of these guys are going to be first-time coordinators. Some of these folks are going to be coordinators that would be returning to the position but haven't held the position in a while. Clint Kubiak is probably my number one guy out of the San Francisco 49ers. He was a passing game specialist there, former Minnesota Vikings offensive coordinator. And he's basically coming out of the Bobby Slowick trend or tree, not tree, like kind of taking the same trajectory as Bobby Slowick, who is now the offensive coordinator over in Houston, and helped to kind of build that offense for CJ Stroud and all that into massive success. Y'all know he was, every day, he was a number one on my list for offensive coordinator, not number one for head coach, but he was number one on my list for offensive coordinator. And so I'm looking at kind of that same trajectory, right? Another guy coming out of that Shanahan system as a passing game coordinator that's done some incredible things, did some fantastic stuff with Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson back in 2021, all that. Like, yeah, that's a guy that makes sense. And there's a bunch of others as well. Zach Robinson over in Los Angeles and others. And those are the guys that like we know will be available, but there's a bunch of other guys that are going to become available too, who's looking to climb out of the coaching ranks, who's looking to, move, who gets canned from another team as a head coach or something like that and ends up falling an offensive coordinator or whatever. Is that a Frank Reich opportunity or something? Like there's a lot of those. That's not the route I would go, but I'm just giving an example. So for me, like, that's number one on the list for me when it comes to all I want for next year for the New Orleans Saints and it's a new offensive system. Coming up next, let's take a look at the best way to close out the season. What would be the best way for the New Orleans Saints to close out the season? We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Gametime is the place to be when it comes to purchasing tickets for your favorite events, whether they're sports events, whether it's music, like concerts and stuff like that. Maybe you're looking at instead like comedy. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that as well. Like there's a ton over on Gametime. And the thing that I love about Gametime is that on average, folks spend much less money going through Gametime than any other ticketing provider out there. So I highly recommend that you go and check out Gametime, whether you're looking for Saints tickets or maybe you're looking for tickets for something else. They'll have you covered. And you even get to see like a view from your seat before you purchase tickets and everything. It's awesome. And it helps you basically take the guesswork out of buying tickets. You can do that with the Gametime app. So go over, download the Gametime app today, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Let's Get it, Who Dat Nation, wrapping up this Christmas Day episode of Locked On Saints. Appreciate you, as always, for being an everydayer and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, we're going to dive in a bit more to kind of what's left for the New Orleans Saints. We'll get into the way more complicated, what do the Saints need to do to get a playoff spot and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to do that today because this is just kind of a lighter episode, but we'll dive into kind of the nitty gritty of all of that. And also just take a look at, what's the expectation for the Saints going into this game against Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So we're going to kind of get into all that in tomorrow's Tuesday episode, as well as some film notes and stuff like that, which we'll dive in a little bit more in depth into the film notes from Los Angeles on Wednesday. Wednesday will kind of be that big day for us. All right. So the best way for the New Orleans Saints to close out the season would be to at least beat the Falcons at home. Like, for me, that's kind of the thing here, right? Like, listen, the Saints, by all intents and purposes, should be focused on a winning against the Bucs in Tampa and then coming home and closing out the season with a win against the Atlanta Falcons. There's no doubt about that. The likelihood of the Bucs doing their part in losing to the Carolina Panthers at the end of the season doesn't seem super likely. And if the Saints lose to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Tampa, then it's curtains, right? Like, it's done at that point. And so the Saints might go into that Week 18 game against the Atlanta Falcons with no road to the playoffs. But would beating the Atlanta Falcons at home still be pretty sweet to close out the season? Of course it would, right? Like, for most Saints fans, even those that want the Saints to fall as far as possible for a better draft pick and all these other things, most of those Saints fans even still want the Saints at all times to beat the Atlanta Falcons. And there's a chance that that could still happen. If you look at where the Saints are right now in the draft, number 12 overall. And I did promise we would talk a little draft stuff today, so we will do that. I haven't forgotten. But the Saints right now draft number 12 overall. If they beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they would go up to 8-8. So that'd probably put them around like the 16 through 18 area, with the Arizona Cardinals are picking there because of their Houston pick. Pittsburgh's picking around that area. Cincy will be picking around that area, all that. But if they lose, then they would drop to 7 and 9, and then that would probably move them up, right? That might move them as far as into the top 10, depending upon how Atlanta, the Raiders, the Jets, as well as the Bears all do next week. So it could thrust the Saints into the top 10, in which case some people would go into that Week 18 game against the Atlanta Falcons and say, no, don't win because you're drafting top 10. But here's the thing. If the Saints are drafting around somewhere between, let's say, 11 through 15, okay, let's just say that. Let's even go further, 11 through 18. If there's a prospect that they really like in the top 10, they can trade up to go and get that guy. They have this year's first round pick. They have next year's first round pick. They have the first round pick after that, because the Saints are still drafting players like Jordan Howden in the 5th round, A.T. Perry in the 6th round, getting guys through undrafted free agency like Carl Granderson, like Rashid Shaheed, all that. You can kind of mortgage a little bit of your future if you want to in an attempt to be able to build for the future. But here's the thing that I will say about that. I would really only be down with trading up in the first round if you're drafting somebody that helps you build your future, as opposed to trading up into the first round for somebody that's going to have an impact just right now. And so let me try to give an example of that. If the Saints traded up for, I'm just going to use the name because everyone's using the name right now, Jaden Daniels, but insert your favorite top 10 quarterback here, okay? If the Saints were to do that, I think that there's value in that, because that's not necessarily going to have an impact in 2024. Derek Carr is the starting quarterback in 2024, more than likely, like 99.9% likely. But again, we never say never in the NFL. Drafting a quarterback that you can turn to after a year, turn to after 2 years, or maybe a year and a half. You know how these things go in the NFL. You get a rookie quarterback in there. If the starting quarterback is stinking it up at any point, teams are quick to pull the trigger and throw that rookie quarterback out there. We see it all the time. Hello, Will Levis. Hello, Ryan Tannehill, right? Like, we can see it amongst all the others, right? Netflix did a whole special on Desmond Ridder and Marcus Mariota because of exactly that type of dynamic. And so there's a chance that something like that could potentially happen. And if something like that were to happen, then I would understand trading away pieces of the future. But if you're trading away pieces of the future for a pass rusher, or you're trading away pieces of the future for a wide receiver or something like that, then I'm not necessarily there for it, right? Because then you're really just trying to build around what you need to find a way to make successful anyway. And so ideally, you've already made that successful by changing and revamping the offensive system, building around the team that you already have in free agency, and then continuing to move forward. The salary cap is expected to be north of $240 million this offseason. So that's going to be good for New Orleans. They'll probably have to shed somewhere between like $60 to $90 million, which is like light work for them going into an offseason. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is by restructuring contracts and keeping players around. They're not going to be able to relieve themselves of salary cap tension or space by releasing players. That's just not the way that these contracts are built and things like that. A lot of it's guaranteed money because of previous restructures and all that. So your only hope right now is to continue to kick the can down the road. Now, you can kick the can down the road a little bit less than you usually do, and there are ways to do that. But for the most part, what you're going to see is the Saints restructuring players to clear, $30 million in salary cap space here, $12 million in salary cap space there, $15 million in salary cap space there, and then, one other restructure somewhere that saves some more money and things like that. So, there's a bunch of ways for them to be able to do all that. But when it comes to building around your now, I think they need to do that in free agency, but then focus the draft on building for their future. And I think that would become really, really important. So when it comes to wrapping up the season here at the end, I think getting that win against the Atlanta Falcons gives a little bit of sweetness to a bitter end to the season, what we expect will be a bitter end to the season. But on top of that, beyond just the nice win against the Atlanta Falcons, it won't ruin the Saints' opportunity to be able to invest in their future. Whether they trade up for a Jaden Daniels, whether they trade up for a Joe Alt, whether they trade up for a Drake May, no matter what it is that they do, which would be wild and a lot of fun to cover, but no matter what it is that they do to end this season, they'll be in position to go up and do what they want to do in the draft, as long as they're willing to pay the price for it. And as long as they're paying a price that allows them to build for their future, and I would put a Joe Alt, for instance, in that category, as opposed to a win now category type of move, like a wide receiver or, trading up for I'm just going to use the example of drafting a tight end in the top 10 because the Falcons did it and it was stupid and all those other things. Those things to me are more we feel really good about what we have in the building, and so now we just want to add to it. No. Build for your future if you're going to mortgage the future. If you're going to stick and pick at 15, 16, 17, 18, whatever, fine. Grab somebody that's going to have an impact right now. Totally fine. You probably are going to want another wide receiver. We'll see what happens with Michael Thomas. Maybe that's the route they go. I think offensive line is a place that they really need to invest in, and defensive line is a place that they could really stand to invest in as well. And I think that they've learned that the speed edge rusher has value, so maybe that opens the door for them to be able to start drafting that prototype. Thank you, Zach Bond, for for making good on the opportunity when you finally got it, right? So, that's the way that I look at it, though. If you get the opportunity here to wrap up the season with a win against the Atlanta Falcons, I think that that's enough to just sort of have a little shine of positivity, a little glimmer of a silver lining at the end of the season, to where fans will go, well, at least they beat the Falcons at home, or maybe it's more at least they didn't lose to the Falcons at home. We'll see what it looks like when we get there. All right, y'all. Well, I really appreciate you. Thank you very much for coming through for another episode of Locked on Saints. And again, Merry Christmas to all who observe. Happy holidays as well, and everything. Really, really appreciate all the love, all the support, and everything. Just, I don't know, wouldn't be the holiday season without you. So I had to get at least some kind of even a casual, just kind of chat 'em up type of episode out to you today. So I hope that you enjoy. And of course, we'll be right back here with you for another episode, taking a look at the playoff scenarios a little bit more in depth, a little bit of film notes and all that good stuff. I appreciate you as always, y'all, for making Locked on Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how your mom and them. Trust Who Dat Nation. Merry Christmas.